The first thing I heard wasn't his voice. It was the sharp snap of a folder closing. Then came the words that sliced through the silence like breaking glass. Effective immediately, Laura Kent, lead systems engineer, is dismissed. For a brief second, the entire boardroom seemed to freeze. The projector light flickered across frozen charts. Pens stopped midair. Nobody dared to move. At the head of the long oak table, Richard Vale, our freshly appointed CEO, announced my dismissal with the cold precision of a doctor delivering bad news. No hesitation, no emotion, not even a glance in my direction. To him, I wasn't a person. I was a barrier to be removed. I felt heat crawl up the back of my neck. 7 years. 7 years of building CoreVantage's modular system piece by piece, line by line, clause by clause, reduced to a single sentence. And the humiliation wasn't behind closed doors. It was public. Every executive, every director sat there, watching as I was erased in real time. Still, I refused to give Richard the pleasure of seeing me break. I gathered my notes, lifted my head, and quietly said the only word that would disturb their fragile silence: appreciate it. A few people shifted in their seats, unsure if it was resignation or defiance. It wasn't either. They didn't understand. I knew something they didn't. Hey, before we go deeper, how's your day going? Have you had a moment to breathe? Maybe look away from the screen for a bit? There's more to life than deadlines. Let me know where you're tuning in from. And if this story already has your attention, hit the like and subscribe buttons. It helps us keep these stories alive every day. I wasn't just a job title in an organization chart. As the lead systems engineer, I was the backbone of CoreVantage. When budgets fell apart, I kept the company running. When servers crashed, I coded through the night. It was my work that made CoreVantage's $190 million flagship platform a reality. I sacrificed weekends, missed birthdays, and spent countless nights proving that the work done in dimly lit labs mattered more than the polished speeches echoing in upper offices. Richard Vale never carried that kind of weight. His career was built on sleek presentations and clever buzzwords, perfected in consulting firms where nothing tangible ever came to life. He marched into the CEO chair with the confidence of someone who had never been tested, armed with his favorite catchphrases: synergy, streamlining, efficiency targets. To him, words were currency, and he spent them like they could replace the years I had forged in steel, silicon, and sleepless nights. He was a man drunk on prestige, blind to the work that gave those titles meaning. That morning stripped everything bare. Richard thought letting me go was strategy, a move toward progress. In his mind, he'd won. But as the board stared at me like I was collateral damage, I felt something far stronger than humiliation: clarity. I had known this was coming. I had prepared for it. Richard Vale, CEO or not, had no idea how much control he had just surrendered to me. The silence from that boardroom trailed after me like a shadow. It followed me down the corridor, into the elevator, out through the glass doors of CoreVantage's headquarters. I sat in my car, hands locked around the steering wheel, the engine refusing to turn over. For 7 years, I had been the anchor, the one who kept the storm from tearing the ship apart. And in less than 60 seconds, Richard Vale had cut me loose in front of the same people who once called me indispensable. What I didn't expect was how quickly the aftershocks would spread. By the next morning, my phone screen glowed with notifications, not sympathy, but confusion. Messages from engineers, analysts, project leads, people trying to understand how the foundation could vanish overnight. They didn't realize it yet, but the system they were trying to steady had already begun to crack. Are we even supposed to keep working on the platform? Logan messaged first. HR says everything's on hold until new leadership is settled. Priya added a few minutes later. And then Dylan, ever the skeptic, sent the simplest text of all. Guess we're replaceable after all. Their messages carried fatigue and disbelief. These weren't just employees. They were some of the sharpest engineers I'd ever worked with. Now they sounded like soldiers left behind in a war no one admitted was still going on. I stared at each message, the weight of it pressing against my chest. The silence around me was suffocating. I had fought for these people, carved out a space where creativity could breathe, where deadlines didn't crush spirit. And now they were adrift, questioning everything because one executive's ego demanded a sacrifice. The guilt hit hard. Had I failed them? Had my silence in that boardroom sealed their fate? I kept hearing that single word, appreciate it, the way it echoed back at me, hollow and fragile. Did it sound weak? Did they think I'd given up? For the first time in years, I doubted my own instincts. Maybe Richard was right. Maybe leadership really was about charm, not conviction, about connections, not commitment. Then, at 3:04 that afternoon, my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a senior engineer. It was Jason, the intern. He wasn't supposed to know much beyond QA scripts and bug reports. His message was short, almost casual. They don't know who actually owns the original patent, do they? I froze. My pulse spiked. Jason had stumbled onto the truth. No one knew, not Richard, not the board, not anyone. During the chaos of the budget cuts 2 years earlier, I'd done something they never noticed. I filed the modular framework patent under a separate entity. Redline Systems, my entity, the architecture, the licensing rights, the very skeleton that made CoreVantage's entire system possible, it all sat in my private vault, not theirs. For the first time since my firing, the emptiness cracked open. Doubt still lingered, but underneath it flickered something alive, leverage. Jason's message had reminded me the game wasn't over. It had only just begun. That night, my apartment looked less like a home and more like an evidence archive. Stacks of binders, contracts, and marked-up notebooks covered every inch of the kitchen table, spilling onto the floor. The flickering light above me threw long, restless shadows across the mess. I pictured Richard Vale in his glass, walled penthouse across the city, sipping something expensive while rehearsing talking points for tomorrow's investor briefing. He had the skyline view. I had peeling paint, cold coffee, and a mountain of truth. I sat in the heavy quiet, the kind that presses on your chest until it hurts to breathe. My phone buzzed again, more worried messages from the team. I didn't answer. I didn't have reassurance to give them. All I had were these folders, fragments of every meeting, every argument, every signature that had built CoreVantage's empire. And the deeper I went, the sharper the loneliness cut. 7 years. 7 years of my life traded for a company that threw me out like an outdated processor. The thought clawed at me, maybe they were right, maybe I was finished, but that whisper didn't last long. Because beneath it, another voice stirred, the same one that had kept me coding through blackouts, fighting through budget cuts, refusing to let my work vanish under someone else's name. My eyes burned as I flipped through file after file, until my hand paused on a yellowed envelope wedged beneath old quarterly reports. I pulled it free and unfolded the single printed email, inside timestamped 2 years earlier. I recognized it instantly. Finance had just announced a budget realignment. And in that moment, I finally understood where to start. Our team had been seconds away from being gutted. That was the night I stayed awake until dawn, drafting an alternate blueprint, one that rerouted CoreVantage's modular platform through a separate legal entity I'd quietly established. My pulse quickened as I reread the email, this time slower, letting each sentence slice through the haze of exhaustion. Buried halfway down the message was a clause so ordinary, so technical, it could have easily gone unnoticed. In the event of termination of project oversight or withdrawal of funding, All proprietary rights revert to the original architect until full reintegration. I set the paper down, hands trembling. That was it, the thread everyone else had missed. Richard thought that by stripping away my title, he'd taken my power. He believed public humiliation could undo years of planning. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that their decision to cut me loose had activated the very clause that handed ownership of the patent right back to me. The room around me was still cramped, still cluttered, still thick with fatigue. Yet suddenly, it didn't feel like confinement anymore. It felt like a command post. Alone, yes. Exhausted completely. But beneath the ache, something harder began to form, resolve. They had just handed me the key to dismantle their empire. The first fracture in Richard Vale's spotless reign appeared on a Thursday morning, exactly 9 days after my firing. I wasn't there to see it, but I didn't have to be. In the tech world, nothing travels faster than panic, especially when it unfolds in front of investors. Executives had flown in from 3 cities, gathering inside CoreVantage's glass, paneled auditorium for a highly polished product demo. Richard had promised them perfection, a seamless showcase that would open the floodgates to billions in funding. But perfection never arrived. Instead, silence filled the room. The demo dashboard glowed, flickered, and then froze on a single message printed across a blank white screen. License authorization expired. At first, no one seemed to understand. A low murmur spread polite confusion, the kind reserved for trivial technical hiccups. Richard laughed a strained, brittle sound and motioned toward the engineers at the back. Just a glitch, he called out, give us 2 minutes. 2 minutes became 10. 10 became 20. Every command, every restart, every line of code produced the same cold reply. License authorization expired. Meanwhile, I was in my apartment, the same small, dim place that had seen more sleepless nights than rest, watching the situation unfold through a private Slack channel I still had access to. Logan typed, "They're panicking. Ops can't reach the servers." Priya followed with a single emoji, a small gray lock. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the quiet pull at the corner of my mouth. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. And then it happened, the moment I'd been waiting for, the inevitable slip. In the middle of the chaos, Ellen, CoreVantage's director of operations, raised her voice above the nervous murmurs. "Wait," she said, holding a tablet high. "Are we saying we've actually lost control of the platform?" The words cut through the air like a blade. Every head turned toward her, the investors, the executives, the board, all of them. And then Richard Vale's smile, that perfectly practiced executive grin, cracked. For the first time, he didn't look like a leader. He looked like a boy caught stealing something he couldn't afford to lose. "Of course not," he stammered, tugging at his cufflinks. "We have backups, multiple redundancies, everything's under control." But his voice betrayed him. It trembled on the last word, just enough to send a visible shiver of unease through the room. Investors shifted in their seats. A few glanced at their watches. Others whispered to assistants, already calculating their exit strategies. I could picture it vividly, Richard standing under the harsh white lights of that auditorium, his custom suit doing little to hide the sweat gathering at his collar, while the empire he thought he'd secured began to crumble right in front of him and me. I was miles away, sitting in a second-hand chair, surrounded by papers and old coffee cups, feeling a quiet, steady pulse of satisfaction in my veins. This was what preparation looked like. The reward for reading every single line of every single clause while everyone else was too busy playing politics. They had thought my dismissal ended the story. They couldn't have been more wrong. Cutting me off hadn't erased my influence, it had activated it. Their action had triggered the exact clause that turned CoreVantage's flagship system into a sealed vault, one that could only be unlocked by me. I didn't gloat. I didn't send cryptic messages or indulge in dramatic monologues. I simply leaned back, folded my arms, and let the silence of my apartment wrap around me like armor. For the first time since that boardroom ambush, I didn't feel replaced. I felt inevitable. Tell me something. Which moment struck you harder? When the system froze in front of the investors, or when Ellen's question sliced through the room and wiped the smile off Richard's face? And what kind of ending do you think Laura deserves? Redemption? Revenge? Drop your thoughts below. I actually read them all. Stay close, because the story isn't finished yet. The next turn cuts deeper. The morning after CoreVantage's flawless demo imploded, my phone lit up with a number I knew by heart. Human Resources. For a moment, I just watched it ring. Part of me wanted to let it die out, to let them sit in the silence they'd so easily handed me. But curiosity had sharper teeth. What story would they tell this time, Laura? The voice came bright, polite, and too carefully cheerful. It's Megan from HR. How have you been holding up? We've all been so worried. Worried, the word almost made me laugh. Where was that concern when Richard had publicly dismantled my career? When my team unraveled under confusion? When the system, my system, began slipping through their hands? I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, not because I cared, but because I wanted to hear them sweat. I'm fine, I said, my voice flat, even. Good, good. She rushed on, relief spilling out like steam. It's been a rough few days, as I'm sure you've seen. Leadership has been talking, and we feel it would be mutually beneficial if you returned. You know, to help restore continuity. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the phrases roll over me. Mutually beneficial. Restore continuity. Pretty packaging wrapped around panic. They weren't calling because they valued me. They were calling because they were sinking. CoreVantage's $1 billion platform had become a locked vault, and the only person with the key was the one they'd tried to erase. I could picture Richard Vale pacing the length of his glass, walled office, barking orders, telling HR to fix this. They'd probably held a meeting before the call, rehearsing every word, searching for that perfect balance between warmth and authority. Not too apologetic, not too desperate, but every syllable carried the same undercurrent, fear. I kept my tone level. So you want me back? Well, yes, the HR rep blurted. The investors are uneasy, and the team clearly trusts you. This is about stability. Of course, we'd be open to discussing adjustments to your compensation package. And there it was, the bait. Money, the universal fix they thought could heal anything. They still didn't understand. They believed loyalty could be purchased. That the years I'd poured into the architecture, the nights spent in the glow of half-dead monitors, could be returned for a bigger paycheck. I almost laughed. Instead, I let silence fill the line until I could sense her squirming on the other end. Then, slowly, carefully, I spoke, shaping each word like a blade. You don't have enough money, I said. I'm sorry, she stammered. You don't have enough money to buy back the truth. I continued, steady. Not the nights I didn't sleep. Not the years I spent shielding your company from collapse. Not the patent you tried to bury. And certainly not my silence. The line went still. I could hear her breathing, short, uneven, searching for a script that didn't exist. And for the first time since that boardroom ambush, I felt no anger, no uncertainty, only clarity. They finally understood. The foundation was never theirs, it had always been mine. I ended the call before she could recover. No shouting, no victory speech. Just a clean, deliberate click. My voice was calm. My hands didn't shake. They believed power resided in corner offices and stock options. But that day, I learned the truth. Real power lives in the refusal to be owned. 2 days later, as I sifted through a pile of unread messages, one email stopped me cold. Subject: invitation to discuss strategic alignment. The sender wasn't CoreVantage. It was a name I hadn't seen in years, Ardent Dynamics. One of our fiercest rivals. I stared at the screen for a long moment, my cursor hovering over delete. It was too perfect, too conveniently timed. CoreVantage's flagship system had barely collapsed, the board was in free fall, and now suddenly a competitor wanted to talk. Warnings flashed from every corner, but curiosity is stubborn. It doesn't always obey logic, so I opened the email. The message was short, deliberate like it had been written by someone who already knew I'd read between the lines. We're aware of the turbulence at CoreVantage. If you're open to a conversation, we'd like to meet. See. Dalton Chris Dalton. The name hit like a static charge of memory. He had been one of us once, a senior engineer with ideas too bold and a temper too sharp for the suits upstairs. Years back, Richard labeled him difficult and fired him under the banner of restructuring. Chris didn't protest. He'd laughed, said Richard Vale couldn't tell innovation from illusion, and walked out. Now, years later, he was back, representing Ardent Dynamics, one of CoreVantage's biggest rivals. Every instinct told me this was dangerous. Rivals don't extend olive branches, they extend hooks, and yet I agreed. We met at a quiet cafe just outside the city center, the kind of place where the lights were dim, the coffee was strong, and the staff had perfected the art of pretending not to hear. Chris looked older, a few more creases, a little more gravity, but the same knowing grin, half smirk, half dare. Laura Kent, he said, settling into the booth, never thought I'd see you sitting on the other side of the glass. Life's full of surprises, I replied evenly. He gave a low chuckle. Richard always had a talent for getting rid of the people who actually made things work. First me, now you, though I'll admit, you left behind a hell of a lot more than I ever did. I studied him, keeping my expression unreadable. You didn't call me here to walk down memory lane. He leaned closer, elbows on the table, lowering his voice. You're right, Ardent's been watching. Investors are panicking, clients are second guessing, but we both know that system doesn't move without you. My pulse quickened, but I didn't let it show. And what makes you so sure of that? His grin widened, sharper this time. He reached into his bag, slid a tablet across the table, and turned the screen toward me. It was a copy of CoreVantage's licensing agreement, the one I'd written 2 years earlier. A single clause glowed in highlighted gold. Clause 7. 2. 1 Oversight Authority, he said. Vale doesn't realize, does he? Without your credentials, those modules are just empty shells. For a moment, the room blurred into silence. The chatter, the soft hum of background music gone. I stared at the familiar line, my claws, my safety net. Chris leaned back, satisfied. So, Laura, he said quietly, the real question isn't whether the system still works. It's who you want it to work for. I took a measured sip of coffee, masking the storm that built behind my calm expression. Caution coiled tight in my ribs, but curiosity sparked beneath it. For the first time since my firing, someone outside CoreVantage had spoken the truth aloud, and that changed everything. The next morning, I woke to headlines that almost made me laugh. CoreVantage regains stability, system restored. But I knew the truth. They hadn't repaired anything. They'd simply rebooted a system that still listened to me. It had to be Richard. He was the one who fed the story to the press, his face plastered across every news outlet, every tech blog, hailed as the visionary who restored stability to CoreVantage. He stood before the board that morning like a performer hitting his mark, his tone clipped, his confidence rehearsed. He called it a triumph of leadership and teamwork, credited the heroic resilience of DevOps, every word polished, every gesture measured. For a brief moment the illusion held, the board stopped panicking, investors unclenched, even my old team reached out, uncertain what to believe. Did he actually fix it? Logan messaged. Priya sent only a single symbol, a question mark. I stared at the screen, a knot tightening in my stomach. Richard was trying to rebuild his empire on smoke and mirrors. But illusions are fragile things and dangerous when left unchallenged. I knew the truth. A system doesn't come back to life through denial. No amount of press coverage or confidence can rewrite code or override legal clauses. Whatever Richard was running, it wasn't the platform. It was a hollow imitation, a shadow of the real thing, designed to fool those who didn't know where to look. And then, less than 24 hours later, the illusion cracked at 9:17 a.m. CoreVantage flatlined. Not a glitch, not a slowdown, a full collapse. Demo environments, client sandboxes, investor test servers. All dark. Across the building, screens lit up with the same gray line of text that had haunted their last downfall. License authorization expired. Inside CoreVantage's headquarters, panic spread like fire. I didn't have to be there to witness it. Dylan's message said enough. He's losing it. They can't access anything, not even staging. By mid-morning, the story had already leaked. The same reporters who'd called Richard a genius hours before were now circling like sharks, tearing into the narrative. And that, Riskakad, one want to ignore it headline asked, only to fail again in under 24 hours. I sat back, watching it unfold from the quiet of my apartment, the empire collapsing under the weight of its own lies. Richard had built his kingdom on confidence. I had built mine on code, and code, unlike confidence, doesn't bend to illusion. Inside the boardroom, chaos ruled. Richard tried to bluff his way through it, barking orders, throwing around words like sabotage, malfunction, temporary outage. But the faces staring back at him were done believing. The room that once nodded at every sentence now glared with open doubt. Someone demanded to see the system logs. Another asked for live date, a proof. That's when the cracks finally split wide. The truth spilled out like oil on glass. The restored, platform Richard had flaunted before the board wasn't real. It was a shallow mock-up, a demo environment stitched together for optics. No actual functionality, no licensing authority. No legal standing, smoke and mirrors, nothing more. A senior director finally said it aloud, voice flat with disbelief. You misled us, Richard. This wasn't restoration. It was theater. His face drained of color, the board's patience already paper, then tore apart. Investors started yanking their calls mid-meeting. Strategic partners froze communications. And the man who'd strutted into the CEO chair full of polished arrogance now looked cornered, his eyes darting, sweat darkening the collar of his designer shirt. From my apartment, I watched it unfold in real time, updates trickling through private messages and company whispers. The collapse rippled outward like a shockwave, only this time it wasn't mine to bear. It was his. The system was doing exactly what I'd built it to do, protect itself from the wrong hands. And Richard Vale, the so-called savior of CoreVantage, had just been exposed as a fraud in front of the very people who once worshipped his confidence. When the call from the board finally came, I wasn't surprised. The second collapse had left them with no options. What did surprise me was the tone. Gone was the polite dismissal, replaced by something that sounded almost like fear. They wanted me back in the executive chamber. By morning, I arrived early. The building felt different now, quieter, heavier. Employees pretended to focus on screens, but their eyes followed me as I passed. The tension in the air was electric, the kind that hums before a storm breaks. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was brittle. Half the directors were flushed with anger, the others pale with panic. And near the door, Richard stood, shoulders tense, eyes hollow, like a guard dog, uncertain whether to bark or run. Laura, he started, voice cracking at the edges. There's no need for this. The situation is under control." A director cut him off sharply. "We don't sit down, Richard." The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time, he obeyed. And in that silence, I realized something. The power I had fought to build all those years ago wasn't lost. It had simply been waiting for me to take it back. He flinched but didn't move. I didn't even look at him. My attention was fixed on the table, on the rows of faces that had once radiated arrogance, but now sat hollow, stripped of certainty. "Thank you for coming," the chairman said, his voice cautious like every word might splinter. "We'd like to discuss a way forward." I set my folder on the table and spoke with deliberate calm. "I'm not here to ask for my position back," I said. "Let's make that clear first." A ripple ran through the room, soft murmurs, startled glances. They expected a negotiation, maybe an appeal, maybe anger. They didn't expect composure. "I will not return to CoreVantage," I continued. "I will not restore your access." The room stilled. "What I will do is sell the patent." The silence that followed was sharp enough to sting. A director's pen slipped from his hand. Another drew in a sharp breath. The chairman's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking to the folder like it might contain the company's obituary, which, in a way, it did. And then Richard spoke, his voice breaking into something between disbelief and panic. "You don't have that authority." But the documents spread before me said otherwise. Their signatures, their approvals, every overlooked clause and neglected oversight captured in black and white. The truth was no longer a debate. It was a record, and they all knew it. I leaned back slightly, the cool certainty in my voice filling the silence. "This isn't a negotiation," I said. "It's a conclusion." When I left the boardroom, the air in the hallway felt different, lighter. Not free exactly, just final. 2 days later, I walked through the glass doors of Ardent Dynamics. The marble lobby gleamed under soft light. The air smelled of new beginnings, clean, precise, unapologetically ambitious. The hum of conversation around me wasn't frantic like CoreVantage's had been. It was focused. For the first time since Richard had publicly stripped me of everything, I wasn't walking into a room as the discarded one. I was walking in as the one holding the keys. Chris Dalton was waiting by the reception desk, the same halves, murk curling across his face. He didn't bother with pretense. "They know you won," he said. "The only question now is whether you'll let them live with the wreckage or help us build something stronger." Upstairs, the conference room was quiet except for the hum of the city through the glass. On the table lay the contract, pages crisp, margins perfect. The figure printed on the final page almost looked unreal. $1, $1 billion, and above it, in clean black ink, my name, Laura Kent. No longer tied to CoreVantage, no longer erased, just written, finally on her own terms. To anyone else, signing that contract would have meant victory, money, prestige, a clean slate. But to me, it meant something heavier. It meant cutting the last thread that tied me to the sleepless nights and endless battles for a company that had already chosen to forget me. My hand hovered above the page. Money was never the issue. Power rarely is. What clawed at me wasn't greed, it was purpose. I hadn't spent years shaping code, line by line, just to see it twisted into another corporate weapon. It had to mean more than that, so I made a choice. With Chris watching from across the table, I slid a second sheet forward, not part of Arden's draft, but mine. My clause, my condition. Yes, the system would be sold, but on my terms. I would remain its chief advisory architect, not an employee, not a name for display, but the final safeguard. The voice ensuring that what I'd built would never again be misused. Chris raised an eyebrow, then smiled slowly. "Protecting your work even after you walk away," he said. I should have known. When the pen finally touched paper, the weight that had lived on my chest for years lifted. Liberation didn't come in the form of numbers on a check. It came from reclaiming authorship, from deciding who was worthy of holding what I'd made. I signed with a steady hand, my name slicing through the page with quiet finality. CoreVantage had tried to erase me. Instead, I'd written myself into history on my own terms. 14 days. That's all it took for CoreVantage to fall apart. The headlines hit first, patent lost, CoreVantage collapses. Then came the numbers, brutal, merciless. The company's value plummeted in a single morning. Partners walked away. Contracts dissolved. The empire Richard Vale had paraded as untouchable crumbled under the weight of arrogance and ignorance. The man who'd once smirked while dismantling my career was now reduced to a whisper. A cautionary tale passed quietly across boardrooms. The CEO who never read the fine print. I watched the downfall unfold with a strange calm, almost clinical. The same executives who had applauded my removal now tripped over each other trying to distance themselves from him. By the end of the week, shareholders demanded his resignation. The board, cornered by its own negligence, had no choice but to comply. The last image of Richard Vale remains clear in my mind. A press conference, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions that cut sharper than any code I'd ever written. He sat off to the side, shoulders slumped, tie askew, the spotlight he once worshipped now burning him hollow. For the first time, the man who built his identity on confidence had none left. And then there was me. I stepped into the same light, calm, composed, deliberate, every camera turned, every lens followed. The new contract waited in front of me, the future spelled out in ink. I picked up the pen, the years condensed into a single heartbeat. Flashbulbs ignited, freezing the moment in light, and for the first time in a very long time, nothing held me down. No doubt, no bitterness, no shame, only pride, sharp, fierce, earned. Thank you, I said softly, because in that moment I understood they hadn't just handed me control. They had handed me the ending. The silence that followed was heavier than applause. Because sometimes the greatest revenge isn't fire or fury. It's standing tall when they expect you to crawl. It's rewriting the story they thought they owned and signing your name beneath it. If this story reached you, if you've ever been underestimated, silenced, or told you didn't matter, remember this. Your worth isn't defined by someone else's table. It's written in what you choose to build after they walk away. So tell me, which moment in Laura's journey stayed with you the most? And how do you imagine the ending should feel? Share your thoughts below, tap like and subscribe, because maybe the next story we tell will be yours.